So, I originally wrote 3 pages of the script about the Snyder Cut of Justice League in December 2017, then shelved it because the writing was going a bit slow, and I figured that by the time I got it out, it would have blown over and no one would care anymore. Well, now it's December 2019, so let's talk about why the Zack Snyder Cut of Justice League both does and does not exist. Alright, a bit of background. Warner Bros. Justice League, the last Snyder-helmed entry in the DC Extended Universe and a direct sequel to 2016's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, opened on November 17, 2017 to largely middling reviews and lukewarm audience reception. The film, which cost between $300 and $350 million, excluding promotion, underperformed at the box office, surpassing its strict production budget with a worldwide box office of a little under $660 million, but falling far short of the billion-dollar return Warner Bros. Was hoping for, which would have placed it in the same competitive category as Disney's Star Wars and Avengers films. The film has turned a reasonable profit in the long run between box office and home release, but you don't put $350 million into a movie just to get a reasonable profit. Ardent fans of the franchise have pinned the film's lack of success on a combination of studio meddling and a conspiracy of critics who fans claim are determined to see the DC Extended Universe fail. The first of those is wishful thinking, while the second is pure fantasy. Now, the final run of Justice League's development was troubled. In May of 2017, following the tragic death of his daughter, Zack Snyder withdrew as head of the project to be with family and focus on grieving. Simultaneously, Joss Whedon was brought on board to take his place and helm the final delivery of the film. While this was initially presented as Joss essentially just running it in and overseeing some minor additional photography Snyder had already planned prior to his departure, Joss's involvement rapidly ballooned. Rumors had already been circulating that Warner Bros. Weren't happy with the film, including specific allegations that executives called the film unwatchable after a screening in April. The suspicion is that while Snyder stepped back for reasons of personal tragedy, this provided the opportunity for executives at Warner Bros. To cut him out entirely. This suspicion is supported by the expansion of the additional photography from 2 weeks to 2 months, with an estimated cost of around $25 million. This additional photography included a particularly high-profile conflict with Superman actor Henry Cavill's role on the then-upcoming Universal film Mission Impossible 6 that required Warner Bros. To digitally remove Cavill's mustache from all the new footage, an effect that is, charitably, not very good. As an end result, critics and audiences largely agree that the final film distinctly feels like an uneven mashup of the two directors' styles. Not a merger, but more like two different films starring the same actors had just been cut together. A particularly aggressive slice of the fandom has, in response, started a petition demanding that Warner Bros. Release Zack Snyder's version of the movie, the film as it was before Whedon was brought on board, under the banner Release the Snyder Cut. Zack Snyder himself has, over the course of 2019, increasingly leaned in on the Release the Snyder Cut phenomenon, which, it makes sense. It directly serves his ego and the fact that Warner Bros. Hasn't let him anywhere near a director's chair since 2017, to the point that Snyder had to take Army of the Dead to Netflix after a 7-film run with Warner's. In early December 2019, Zack Snyder posted a photo on Vero of a rack of film canisters labeled Justice League Director's Cut, running time 214 minutes, with the overlaid text, "Is it real? Does it exist? Of course it does." So, does the Snyder Cut exist? Well, as the image says, of course it does, depending on your definition of exist. Now, just to be clear, there is saved to a hard drive somewhere a version of the film Justice League that could be called the Zack Snyder Cut. There is a rack of film canisters containing a 3.5-hour version of Justice League. These are the Snyder Cut. The problem is that it doesn't look like this, it looks like this. That right there is part of the leaked work print of X-Men Origins Wolverine, a version of the film as it existed about 3 months before release. It is highly instructive for our purposes here because it clearly demonstrates the piecemeal nature in which effects-heavy films are finished. Films aren't made like Apocalypse Now anymore, where there's a million feet of footage that the director can endlessly recombine into a more or less finished movie. Almost every single frame of Justice League involves some degree of manipulation. Elements like sky replacements, fog and particle effects, vehicle replacements, backgrounds, signs, logos, costumes, so on, so forth. Now, the petition writers assert that there is a more or less complete Snyder version of the movie, stemming from misunderstanding some tweets by Larry Fong talking about the digital intermediary process. The petition's conspiracy hinges on a misunderstanding of the term picture lock. So first we need to talk about picture lock. It is not the point where the image is complete, but the point where the shot choices, shot length, scene order, and core editing are more or less done. In practice, it's a very loose term, and the euphemistic phrase soft lock is often thrown around on productions. It's not a physical state, but a social agreement between departments to stop changing things. Though, changing things still happens a lot. The point of picture lock is to get the film to a point where other post-production departments like digital graphics, digital effects, Foley, sound mixing, and score can start working without too much of a risk that their work is going to go to waste, that they're not going to spend a week rotoscoping wires just for the shot to be replaced with an alternate take or a different angle once they're done. And again, that still happens all the time. This all means that picture lock on effects-heavy films tend to roll out in chunks, with scenes or even shots being locked on a rolling basis in order to allow the effects team to get to work. Since digital effects on films like Justice League can take upwards of 2 years, this even leads to some scenes being edited and locked while the movie is still being shot. Again, X-Men Origins is highly instructive. There are scenes and shots that are identical to their theatrical versions, including Foley, score, and color grade, but these are right next to scenes that are ungraded, incomplete with temp effects and score. And remember, this version was a mere 3 months before the film was released. A version of Justice League from over 6 months before release is going to be even more extreme, especially since there were segments Snyder was already planning to reshoot or do extra photography for. So when Justice League went into 8 weeks of additional photography, there were 3 possible outcomes for any given scene that Snyder already planned to reshoot. 1, the scene was shot according to his instructions. 2, the scene was shot but changed from his plan. Or 3, the scene was never shot at all. That leaves a lot of potential holes in any possible Snyder cut, including scenes that now literally just don't exist. So now let's take a bit to talk about what reshoots and additional photography are, because they're a thing that's been in a much higher public profile in the last few years, following a series of films that underwent extensive reshoots late in production. And this includes Josh Trank's Fantastic Four, David Ayer's Suicide Squad, Gareth Edwards' Rogue One. Modern effects-heavy films all have a phase of additional photography and reshoots. It's a very normal thing. The movies are so big and complex with so much that involves actors working opposite tennis balls in an empty green room that it's inevitable that some of it just isn't going to stitch together. Typical, routine, boring reshoots consist of correcting eye lines, maybe redoing a few lines, or a bit of action to make it all flow. Maybe a subplot is dropped during editing and a new minute or 2 of dialogue is written to patch the gaps left behind, or test audiences don't understand why a thing happens, so a quick insert is created to make it more obvious. Or maybe in the case of Suicide Squad, in addition to being 6 hours long, the producer decides that Steppenwolf is now going to be the villain of Justice League, so you now need to rewrite and reshoot everything in your movie that directly involves the antagonists. These more dramatic instances in recent years are films that are in some state, real or imagined, that the studio considers to be dire, whether they consider it to be unmarketable or possibly actively bad. The released version of Fantastic Four is abysmal, but the Trank cut was probably not in and of itself any better because the Trank footage isn't good. It's worth noting here that while the theatrical cut of Justice League is substantially different from the state of the film when Snyder left, no one has disputed that the core plot remained untouched. I mean, it's still a sequel to Batman v Superman. There are still fundamental problems with the way that Snyder tells a story that were unlikely to just suddenly disappear, especially when Snyder himself has talked a lot about how much dropped footage was setups for later movies. What I'm saying is the Snyder Cut almost certainly had very real problems. The next critical factor is the substantial change in planned runtime. As of August 2017, Warners were telling film buyers to expect a 170-minute runtime, a length that was cut by almost an hour down to 118 minutes in October. Even a 170-minute version of the film is still 44 minutes shorter than the 10-reel director's cut photographed for Vero. That 10-reel version was never going to go to audiences. The economics of theatrical distribution are pretty hostile to films over 3 hours long. Even during the aughts, while Lord of the Rings was riding high and movie runtimes definitely crept upwards, blockbuster films like The Dark Knight and Watchmen still came in under 3 hours. Exhibitors really aren't super fond of any movie over 2.5 hours because that's getting into the range where there's not a lot of time to turn over the theater between shows if you still want to fit in 3 showings per screen per night. And once you're at 3 hours, it's basically impossible to do 3 showings without paying staff to stay until 3 a.m., which is really not worth it unless it's a film that can guarantee butts in seats. Even in 2019, shady-ass corporation Disney, who are actively screwing over exhibitors at every turn, were worried about the 3-hour, 9-minute runtime of Avengers Endgame, and that was the sequel to the 4th highest grossing film of all time. So unless Zack Snyder is incredibly bad at his job and completely oblivious to the economics of making and releasing films, he wasn't done editing his movie. That's just a practical reality of the job. These issues, the movie being visually incomplete at the time Snyder left the project, planned footage that was never shot, and a work print runtime that was never going to go to theaters, this gives us a pretty good idea of what the Snyder Cut would look like. It's a work print full of unfinished VFX, overly long scenes, bloated side content, and missing connective tissue. And like Fantastic Four, or even just Batman v Superman before it, it was probably not actually any good. By the accounts that have trickled out over the past couple years, reports of characters and scenes that were cut entirely, it was probably in a very similar state to Batman v Superman and the pre-reshoots version of Suicide Squad. Bloated, unfocused, overly long, pointlessly grim, and just not particularly good. The list of cut characters, including Adam, Eleanor Stone, Nudist Volko, Darkseid, Desaad, Martian Manhunter, and Hegra, points to a movie suffering from all the same problems as the films that preceded it, overstuffed with setup and cameos at the expense of pacing, payoff, and plot. Now, despite all those very likely problems, I would actually be really interested in seeing the Snyder Cut, especially a work print version of the film. I have no problem watching an incomplete movie where 10 minutes are just storyboards or previs comps of a T-pose Superman flying at a static image of Steppenwolf, or actors in a green room wearing motion capture pajamas. If anything, I think a work print would be more interesting than a finished version. It is, however, unlikely to happen anytime soon. Not impossible, but really, really unlikely. The biggest problem is that Warner's and Snyder himself are unlikely to be willing to release a work print, never mind that there might be substantial complications with various guild and union contracts stemming from commercially releasing a work print when a theatrical version exists. Now, that part can probably be sidestepped by releasing it as a bonus feature with a special edition Blu-ray, so you're not technically just selling the work print, but I don't know because no one to my knowledge has ever done it, especially not for a movie of this scope. But springing from that problem, that Warner's and Snyder don't want to release an incomplete movie, is the cost. VFX experts have estimated that the combined cost of finishing scenes that weren't completed and redoing scenes that were changed would probably cost another $30 to $40 million, and it's a big question mark as to whether or not that would be worth it when the result is unlikely to draw mass attention or even substantially improve the end product. The last and biggest hurdle is ego. Warner Brothers just doesn't want to, because they hold all the cards and don't want to look like they caved or made the wrong choice when they cut Snyder out and reworked the movie. From a political perspective, it is seemingly a lose-lose for Warner Brothers. Like, okay, either the Snyder Cut sucks just as bad as Batman v Superman, being the same bloated, incoherent mess as Snyder's other two Superman movies, or it's amazing. If the movie isn't particularly good, or it's even only kinda slightly better, then they look like suckers for spending tens of millions of dollars finishing a movie that only the most hardcore fans and cinephiles will care about. If they finish and release the Snyder Cut and it's amazing, then they look like the dumbasses who ruined a movie, and the people who made that decision then get fired. And the people who would get fired are the same people who currently get to decide if it ever gets released. So Warner Brothers doesn't have a whole lot of incentive to release it either as a work print or as a finished movie, and this is almost certainly why it didn't surface as an extended edition, director's cut, or even in chunks of bonus features on the home video release. All that's unlikely to change without substantial internal changes in priorities or leadership. However, those changes may have already happened. There are rumors that began circulating in November 2019 that the Snyder Cut of Justice League will be available on Warner Media's HBO Max streaming service when the service launches in May 2020. Using the cut as a teaser to draw subscribers to a subscription platform rather than selling it directly on home video might just provide enough layers of politically convenient cover for Warner's to feel like it's a win, especially since the margins on a subscription service are much higher than on a single Blu-ray. The most persuasive argument supporting the rumors is that on the 2-year anniversary of the film's release, Gal Gadot, Ben Affleck, and Jason Momoa posted the hashtag on social media. Now, the reason that's persuasive is that Gal Gadot and Ben Affleck don't tweet. Their Twitter accounts are run by their publicists. There's functionally no personal content, in contrast to Jason Momoa, whose Instagram is full of personal stuff from selfies to political statements defending the land rights of Native Hawaiians. The point is that Affleck and Gadot are unlikely to have just tweeted the hashtag for fun, and it is reasonable to assume it's part of a promotional campaign. These rumors, vaguely substantiated, insinuate that Snyder self-funded the completion of a cut of Justice League and is at present in negotiation with Warner's. But rumors being rumors, there are also conflicting reports that the version that might possibly be released to HBO Max might in fact be a work print, a rumor seemingly supported by Snyder posting numerous screen grabs of incomplete effects shots to his Vero account. It's not much, and I wouldn't normally include it, but the rumors are an interesting narrative in and of themselves, regardless of whether or not the Snyder Cut does surface on HBO Max. This possibility actually presents a really interesting third outcome to all of this. If Snyder has self-funded completion of his version of the film, it would still be a compromised version, owing to scenes that remain unfilmed, the lesser resources available when self-funding the finished work, and it will remain a hilarious setup for now cancelled sequels and spin-offs, but it will probably at least be a really interesting comparison.